Hey everybody, this is Matt with mathsmath.com. Thanks for joining us here today as we talk about how to multiply and divide integers. We're in the Common Core Math standard of the number system. And we're going to use our previous knowledge of how to multiply and divide, and now we're going to put it into integers and figure out how to do that. Alright? If you think about integers, if you remember, they are positive and negative numbers, counting numbers, like -1, -2, 3, 4, 5, and so forth. Alright? So when we think about multiplying and dividing, we can relate it to breaking things up into different groups. And with that, we're going to ask this question. How do we multiply and divide with integers? That's our guiding question, right? You're going to be able to answer that by the end of the lesson today. Well, here's a group of my students that we get to go out every year. I get to take the 6th graders, and we get to go travel in the woods. We get to spend some nights in cabins, and we get to learn a lot about the outdoors. Well, during that time, we have to make sure that we are dividing the groups up into specific teams so that we know who we are in charge of as teachers. Well, what's that? None other than dividing. We break groups up, we split them up, and then to figure out how many we have, we're going to do some multiplication. We figure out how many are in each group, multiply it by the number of groups, and bam, that's the number of students we're going to use, okay? So that's just a real-life example of where we multiply and divide. If you don't have a chance to do anything like this, I highly recommend it. It's so much fun. All right. Well, how can we multiply using addition? How can we divide using subtraction? Well, if you think about it, multiplication really is just repeated addition. So for example, 3 times 2 is 2 groups of 3. 3 plus 3. You're just going to add 3 twice. Whereas division is repeated subtraction. You got start at 6 and you're going to divide it up into 2 groups. So you're subtracting 3, that's one equal group, to the other equal group of 3 as well. Okay? So really helpful to think about multiplication as being repeated addition, especially. So where 3 plus 3 is the same thing as 3 times 2. Right? So let's fill in these charts and try and figure out the patterns of what happens when you multiply integers. The same rules are going to apply with division. So let's see it. Can you see the patterns? Let's try and fill these in. All right, what's the rule with one negative number? That's the kind of rule we're going to figure out right now, okay? So get your pencil out. Let's get writing. 3 times 4. Well, you guys can all do that. 3 times 4 is 12. 3 times 3, 9. Bam, 3 times 2 is 6. What's the pattern? How do I go from the previous number to the next number? How do I go from 12 to 9? Well, subtract 3. How do I go from 9 to 6? Well, subtract 3, right? That's no big deal. How do you go? So now 3 times 1, that's 3. You can fill that in. 3 times 0 is 0. Again, that pattern's still the same, right? We're subtracting 3 every time. So in essence, we can figure out what 3 times -1 is just by subtracting 3, right? We're going down one number here. Keep going, 0 to -1. We're going to subtract 3. Well, what's 0 minus 3? Stay at 0. Minus 3 means down 3. Puts us at -3. So 3 times -1 is -3. Now, let's continue that pattern of -3 minus 3. So -3 minus 3, they both have the same sign, so we're going to go down to -6. So 3 times -2 is -6. Follow the pattern. 3 times -3 gives me -9. All right, so what's our rule with one negative number? Any idea? All right, if there's one negative number, our answer is what? Positive or negative? Is negative. Okay? If we have one negative in the equation, our answer is going to be negative. Negative. Okay? Let's do this one. What about 2 negatives? All right, well, 3 times 4 is 12, and 1 negative gives us -12, right? Now 3 times 3 is 9, and then we're going to add another negative in there, so that gives us what? -9. And then 3 times 2 is 6, times -1 is -6, and -3. So what's our pattern? How do you go from -12 to -9? How do you do that? Well, it's up. You're going bigger, so it's +3. How do you go from -9 to -6? +3, -6 to -3, +3, and so forth. So our pattern here is +3. We can fill that in all the way down. Okay? Now, 3 times 0 times -1, well, that's easy. That's 0. Now here comes the tricky part. We've got a negative number and a negative number there. Let's follow the pattern. Well, if the pattern is adding 3, what's 0 plus 3? That's super easy. plus 3. And then another again, 6 plus 3 is 9. Okay, so let's look and see what we have. Let's see what happened. So we had 1 positive and 2 negatives. So it looks like 1 positive, 2 negatives, 1 positive, 2 negatives gives us a positive, positive, and positive. So the rule for 2 negatives is that it's positive. Okay, it's pretty simple. The answer is positive. All right, now what I want you to do is I want to do on your own the rule for 3 negatives here. Concentrate on this chunk over here. If you'd like to do this, definitely go ahead. Negative 3 times 4, what is that? There's 1 negative, so your answer is going to be negative. 2 negatives, answer is positive. Fill in here. Now we're going to look at the rule for 3 negatives. Can you take a guess at what 3 negatives is going to be? All right, did you get it all filled in? All right, you'll notice that we have 2 negatives here, so your answer is positive, 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 positive. And you're going, what was the pattern? Could you tell the pattern? It's going down by 3 every time, right? Minus 3, minus 3. So when we get here, you continue that pattern of minus 3, and your answer is negative. So the rule for 3 negatives is your answer is negative. Can you extrapolate this even further and talk about positive or odd amount of negative numbers as opposed to even amount of negative numbers in the equation? Here we've got an even amount of negatives and your answer is positive. Here we have an odd amount of negatives, 1, 2, 3. I don't mean odd like 3 is odd and 1's odd. I mean counting the number of negatives. 1, 2, 3. There's an odd number of negatives and your answer is negative. So if you want to make that general rule, do it. All right, so here it is. 2 times 3, that's 6. Negative 2 times negative 3 is also 6. If you got 2 negatives, make them positive. There you go. Kind of like the banana plus that we've looked at before, right? When you subtract a negative number, put those two together, and you get a positive number. And dividing, same thing. If you think about it, what's 6 divided by 2? That's easy. 3. 6 divided by negative 2 is negative 3. Right? Because if you do it backwards, what's negative 3 times negative 2? Positive 6. All right. Let's talk about exponents here. What is this? Man, look at this ugly thing. Negative 6 squared. Is it different to say negative 6 squared? Well, no, the words aren't different, but the formulas actually look different, don't they? Is there a difference? There actually is. Here, this is negative 6 times negative 6, which is a positive number, whereas this is exponents first with PEMDAS, 6 squared, so it's 6 times 6 is 36, put a negative out front. Okay? So here, it's negative times a negative. Here, it's a positive times a positive. Then at the end, make it negative. Does that make sense? That's a little handwriting trick you've got in math that you got to make sure you're being careful of, okay? But with these guys, is there any difference? What about this? Negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3? Well, that means you'd have 3 negatives. So is your answer positive or negative? Well, as we just learned, if you have 3 negatives, your answer is negative. So the exponent there dictates what is it going to be. If this guy is odd, your answer is going to be negative. If this guy is odd, your answer is going to be negative. If this was negative 3 to the 4th, your answer would be positive. Make sense? All right, well, let's talk about division. Super easy, same thing. Just depends on how many negatives you have in the problem, okay? 1 negative, answer is negative. 2 negatives, your answer is positive. 3 negatives, your answer is negative, and so forth. Why don't you try these guys? Simplify these expressions for me. This is the tricky one right here. Remember, this is 6 times 6, then make it negative, okay? Not like this guy where it's negative 8 times negative 8. All right, need any help? Here's the hints of the answers. Did you get them all right? Check your work. Definitely go back and see which ones you missed. All right, are you able to answer your guiding question now about how do we multiply and divide integers? No big deal, is it? All right, well, this was Matt from mathsmath.com talking about multiplying and dividing integers. Thanks for joining us. Check us out on Facebook at Solving Maths Problems and on Twitter at MathsMath. And enjoy math and hiking in the freezing snow.